This conference will now be recorded.
Yeah, right. All right. Everybody see that? History of Ancient Israel, Hosea chapter 9.
Yes, it's full screen.
Okay. Well, as I've told you all many times, when these authors get real poetic, I get real lost. I don't understand poetry, and so I go to many other sources to help me to figure out what they're saying. And in Hosea chapter 9 is not any different. I was following about every other verse. So there's going to be a lot of stuff that I took out of other Bibles and other commentaries and so on. So here is the timeline that Mark so graciously gave us a long time ago, and this one you can actually read. It's one of the better ones. And don't forget that Hosea here, we're right here. We're at the kind of the tail end of Jeroboam II's uh, kingship. And Jeroboam II was a powerful king. From a secular standpoint, he was a good king. He was not a good king because he didn't obey God, but he got a lot of things done. Did a lot of good things for the nation, but like almost all of the kings of the north, did nothing to restore the worship of the true God. So we're going to start in Isaiah 9:1. And as usual, we're going to take it one verse at a time. Hosea says not to rejoice like other people, like other nations do. Don't have these big parties and all of these things. Here's why. Because you don't deserve it. You don't deserve to rejoice because you've played the harlot against your God. You've made love for hire on every threshing floor. Uh, Now, if you go back, and Mark did a great sermon on the book of Ruth, I don't know, several years ago, I guess now, and a lot of Ruth took place on the threshing floor. That's where, uh, you know.
I did one a couple of weeks ago.
Oh, and I missed it. Well, sorry about that.
Just a quick question. Jill was having trouble connecting, so I was been over and talking to her. Do you have this recording?
I'm recording this one, yes.
Okay. All right. I couldn't see her.
We will find out after we're over whether it recorded. Actually, the problem may not be on my end anyway. It's different on Michael's, but from my computer, I think it's recording. But the problem is that GoToMeeting dropped their conversion software. They have no conversion software. So these things record in a WEBM format. I don't even know what that is. WebM. Uh, and then I have to use an outside conversion source to convert them over to an MP4 so I can then send them to Michael. And I really think that's a lot of the problem. And I've complained to them, said, look, you guys used to have your own conversion software, and now you don't. And a company as big as you all, it's ridiculous. But anyway, I won't get into all of that. You can imagine the choice words that we had or that I had with some of their people. Anyway, in verse 1 here, it's like Hosea walks in on a big celebration that Israel's having, and he warned them, you don't have any right to celebrate anything. You have abandoned Yahweh. And you shouldn't be rejoicing like other nations. God created at creation, that may be redundant, but anyway, he created moeds. He created special days that had special meaning or didn't have special meaning when he created the moeds, but down through the years, Passover, Days of Unleavened Bread, the holy days, Pentecost that we just had, and so on. Those are moeds, and they had special meetings. But that's not what these people were. They were just out getting drunk and having probably orgies and everything else. And Hosea was saying, people, you got to stop this stuff. You don't have any right to do this. So while there's nothing wrong with the nation of Israel or the United States, for that matter, with establishing other days of worship, for instance, Israel established Purim, they established Hanukkah, and I'm not going to go through a bunch of them, but there was nothing wrong with those. But what they did was, the northern tribes anyway, and they joined with the other pagan nations, the other nations around them, to celebrate their gods, little g's, their Elohims. And so God was forgotten. And you know why? Well, the Israelites didn't need him anymore. They were doing just fine. Only they weren't. They just didn't know it. And so it's possible that Hosea may have even confronted an audience at one of the sacrificial centers, when he wrote this, during a feast in a city like Samaria or Bethel. Now, those are Israelite cities, but they had stopped worshiping the true God. And Hosea lived and prophesied during the reign of Jeroboam II, as I showed you here. Here's Hosea, from here to here, the blue line with the yellow line in the middle. He went from the tail end of Jeroboam II's reign through the kings that were murdered. As I've said many times, they didn't reign long enough to get their cards printed. And all the way through almost to the end of Hosea. And what I have read is that when Assyria got hot and heavy about capturing Israelites, he fled to the south. And I don't mean he fled because he was afraid. He went to the south, and that's where he wrote this letter, this book. But anyway, he lived and prophesied during the reign of Jeroboam II, which was a time of peace and prosperity for the Israelites. And even under the next few kings, Zechariah, Shallum, Menahem, and so on, Israel was under a false sense of security, that everything was fine because they had made agreements with these other nations. Now, little did they know that those agreements with the other nations were going to come back and bite them. But these agreements were strictly against God's direct command. In Exodus 34, it says, look, don't make covenants with the inhabitants of the land where you're going, because it's going to be a trap. It's going to be a snare in your midst. But I want you to go in. I want you to destroy their altars, break down their sacred pillars, cut down their wooden images. Why? Because you're not to worship these other gods. And as Michael Heiser says in his book, and Mark, who's spoken on it a couple of times, I think Michael did too, these Elohim actually exist. So many Christians today believe that when God said don't worship an idol, they think that and so did I until a couple of years ago, believed that when God said don't worship an idol, I thought they were worshiping statues. Well, they may have been worshiping statues, but they are Elohim behind those statues. Anyway, so he goes on and he says, you shall worship no other Elohim, little e, little g God, for Yahweh, whose name is jealous. He's a jealous God. It's not, God's not jealous like a boyfriend is jealous when his girlfriend talks to somebody. He's jealous for the benefit of his people. He only wants people to worship him, to listen to him, to look at his law, to obey his law. And then he goes on and he says, because here's what's going to happen. You're going to make a covenant with those people, and you're going to play the harlot. Commit spiritual adultery and worship their gods, and you're going to sacrifice to their gods. And one of you invites you and you eat of his sacrifice. That, if you remember Acts 15, that's exactly what they were talking about when Paul and Barnabas went back to Jerusalem to argue about whether Gentiles should be circumcised in order to be saved. But anyway, and so coming out of that meeting, all they said was four things: don't drink blood, don't commit fornication, don't eat meat sacrificed to idols, and whatever the other one was. But anyway, and it was a subtle way to tell those people, don't go in the temples. It's not good for you. You're going to get in there. You're going to do things that are going to, send you in the wrong direction. But anyway, it says that if you get mixed up with these people, that you're going to have your children intermarry, and his daughters play the harlot with their gods, and make your sons play the harlot with their gods. In other words, well, you all follow that. And God doesn't make laws, rules, if you will, just for the fun of it. Hey, Jesus, you know what I think? I'm going to make a rule here because I don't want those people to have any fun. No, that's not why he does it. God's laws are to teach us how to live, how to treat others, how to worship God, and to have a prosperous life. They're not just arbitrary rules. Well, anyway, I'm sorry. I guess I could get stuck on that one all day long. So as a result of Hosea saying this, the Israelites did exactly what God had warned them about. Exodus 34:12. And they played the harlot with the gods of these other nations, and still are. It started with Jeroboam the first, and it got worse with every king that followed him. And maybe the biggest mistake of all, and I don't know if you can rank mistakes, but maybe the biggest mistake of all that Israel made was when Ahab brought Jezebel and her father Ethbaal and the gods of Phoenicia into Israel. And when I say the gods of Phoenicia, you all know what I'm talking about. You've heard Mark, you've heard Michael, and we've talked about this a long time. They invited in these other Elohim into, yeah.
I was going to say verse 16 here in Exodus is a prophecy that points that very case out. Verse 16 down here.
Yeah. Yep, that's exactly right. And, well, wouldn't it be nice if we actually listened to what God told us to do? And I tell you, that's a collective we. I'm talking about all people. But anyway, they brought these real Elohim into Israel. Ahab, when he brought in Jezebel and her dad. And so this also takes us all the way back to the time of Samuel, when Israel asked for a king. We want to be like the other nations around us. And this was the joy of the nations, to have another king other than God. That they've got their own king, they've got their own rules, they've got their own laws, and they're having fun. And God told Samuel, hey, let them have what they're asking for. They're going to regret it. But okay, if that's what the Israelites want, then go for it. So back to the threshing floor. At every threshing floor, Israel had attributed the prosperity of her harvests to God? No, to Baal. they were being prosperous because the rain Baal was working, and the sun Baal was helping, and the harvest Baal was, they had all of these different, uh, Baal means Lord, all of these different little L lords. And so Israel had become an adulteress, offering to worship Baal and to receive from Baal the wages of a prostitute. Now, one thing that I don't forget it, but it's not there for me all the time. But these other Elohim did have powers, and they could give people rain and good crops and those kind of things, unless unless Yahweh stopped it. And we're entering a period of time here where Yahweh says, "Okay, we're done. Everybody out of the pool. I am through with you people." So um, they got their wheat at the threshing floor. They had vines and figs and food, water, wool, linen, oil, and drink. And Israel believed that by prostituting herself, and of course they didn't look at it that way, but by prostituting herself in worship of Baal, these other Baals, that Baal in turn blessed her crops and gave her the other necessities of life. But that's not who gave these people the blessings. It was the Father and the Son. Okay, we're all the way down to verse 2. We've already been 20 minutes. He goes on, he talks about the threshing floor again. He says, "The threshing floor and the winepress shall not feed them." Well, this is where they were supposed to get their food, from the threshing floor and from the winepress. "It shall not feed them, and the new wine shall fail in her." Now, one commentary said this, that the threshing floor, as mentioned by Hosea, carries the thought of fornication and fertility rites and so on. Now, I looked and looked and looked, and I couldn't find anywhere where it said that. Now, I don't know where this commentary got it, but they said that the Canaanites frequently used threshing floors and wine presses as places for carrying out their fertility rites. But like I said, I couldn't find any reference. Have any of you all ever seen anything or heard anything on that?
Skip, I'll add something to that. The book of Ruth talks about how when she goes there to, what is his name? Moab. What is the gentleman's name?
Boaz.
Boaz. Okay. She goes there to the threshing floor and stays up there, and he protects her, or she lays down next to him and he covers her up. And I read some of the commentaries related to that, and it was talking about it was a custom that it was where during seasons they would go there and they'd stay there. The men folk would go there and stay there to get the work done, because it's something they kind of work together as a team, such as like kind of like raising a barn would be, and older and more things we might relate to from a couple generations ago. But it would also be a place where when the work is done and before they lay their head down, because they'd stay there for several days or a week or more, is when the partying would start, and the drinking and all the other things that would go along with partying might be in those days, prostitutes or what have you. So that was why it was said in that time that he did a good thing in protecting her from the other men around. And so what I can remember, was it such a big deal to protect her from being at a threshing floor? And that's where the commentary I read about what went on there
Okay.
came from.
Okay.
Well,
Thanks. Yeah.
if you think about it, okay, it's a big time of the year. You've got a lot of folks working for wages. The guys have money in the pockets. Prostitutes want money. Where can we get guys that are ready to spend money? So prostitutes being there makes a lot of sense. Just normal economics.
Yeah. It's like the the Navy boats coming into Ephesus, if you remember from way back when, they come in and so anyway, okay, thanks, Ken, and Jim. The plentiful harvests were about to come to an end. In fulfillment of several of the covenant curses that we read about back uh, in the Old Testament. Well, we're in the Old Testament, but anyway, Yahweh would take away their grain and their wine, and when the blessings of God, which He had given them, for years and years and years, when those blessings had been abused in order to promote sin, like Ken and Jim were just talking about, God takes them away. And so verse 2 shows Hosea's reasons for why Israel should not rejoice. The grain and the wine that they sought as their harlot's wage would not satisfy them or feed them any longer. Verse 3, they shall not dwell, and this is speaking of the nation of Israel, they shall, how about this? They shall no longer dwell in Yahweh's land, but Ephraim shall return to Egypt. And if you remember, Ephraim is a substitute for the word Israel many times, but Israel shall return to Egypt and shall eat unclean things in Assyria. Now, Israel forgot God and set a trap for themselves. These are not things that God had to do. These are things that happened automatically because they were making agreements with pagan nations and so on. And when the kings and the people rejected God, it separated them from God, from the maker of the universe, from however you want to call him, from the most powerful, from the most holy. And so the judgment that was pictured in verse 2, the doing away with the wine and the crops and so on, would be accomplished ultimately through invasion and exile. That's where we're going with this. That's where Hosea is saying, you guys really need to pay attention here. The land belonged to Yahweh, and He was responsible for its fertility, not due to the efforts of the Israelites. And, works pops in my head, Ephesians 2, 8, and 9. By grace are you saved through faith, and that not of yourselves. And we need to remember the same thing. When somebody comes up and tells me, well, Skip, you have to do this and you have to do that, I'm like, hey, let's go take a look at Ezekiel. Ephesians 2, 8, and 9, and let's look at James 4:17 that says, if you know to do something and don't do it, it's a sin. So anyway, I don't know why I got off on that, but it kind of fit. But anyway, when the people attributed the produce of the land to a Baal, they forfeited the blessing of living on it in peace and prosperity. God just finally got fed up with it. And Egypt is metaphorically mentioned here as a symbol of a place of exile. Only as we get farther into chapter 9, I think we're going to find that there were people, or at least it alludes to, that some escaped to Egypt, escaped to Memphis in Egypt to get away from what the Assyrians were doing. We'll see that a little bit later. But Assyria is the location. Egypt is metaphorical, and Assyria is the exact location. I don't know why Hosea is using Egypt, except that they came out of slavery from from Egypt, and they're going back into slavery, metaphorically in Egypt, but literally it's Assyria. So they're in an unclean land, and it says they're going to eat unclean things in Assyria. So they're in an unclean land, and they would be forced to eat unclean food rather than the fruits of God's blessings that He's taken away from them, or He's no longer giving them. Let's look at it that way. But I can't help but wonder, and I've wondered this for months as we've gone through this. If the nation of Israel had moved so far away from worshiping the true God that they would also have moved away from obeying his laws of what foods to eat. So, maybe they were already eating unclean things. I don't know, but Hosea is saying this is what's going to happen to them. They're going to eat unclean food in Assyria. Well, the punishment fit the crime. Israel had become defiled by her sins.
I got a comment on that.
Yeah, Mark.
If they were taken into captivity, this portends that they are taken into captivity. So one thought I had is if they were taken into captivity into Assyria, then they may not have any choice about what they eat to a certain degree. So that could be an answer to this.
Yeah, I think you're exactly right. They, if you wanted to eat anything, you ate what they put in front of you. And
Or at least some of them might not have had a choice. I don't think this is saying every single one will eat unclean things, but that something like this is going to happen. And returning to Egypt may be since it's, here we go, poetic, this is where they were in captivity. So this is a descriptor, a metaphor of, a country that they returned to captivity in.
Yeah, that makes sense.
A good example would be Daniel. He didn't want to eat the unclean things and asked that he just be, allowed to eat. I don't remember what it was, but basically vegetables.
Vegetables, yeah. I think you're exactly right, and Mark's right. There would probably be some people who were believers and obeyers of the true God, and they might have starved to death. Say, I'm not eating that stuff. I mean, we don't know, but I think he's exactly right about Egypt being kind of metaphorical about their captivity. So, okay, thanks, guys. Verse 4. And I thought verse 4 was kind of interesting. They shall not offer wine offerings to Yahweh, nor shall their sacrifices be pleasing to him. So, I think Hosea is telling us that they do make sacrifices, but they're not pleasing to God. He goes on and he says, it should be like the bread of mourners to them. I'm not 100% sure what that means, but anyway, all who eat it shall be defiled. So it kind of tells us what they're sacrificing. It's not a bullock and a lamb. For their bread shall be for their own life. It shall not come into the house of Yahweh. So this, I think, goes kind of with verse 3. They're offering sacrifices of animals that aren't supposed to be on the altar in places where they're not supposed to be offering them, and then they're eating them. So they take a big old sow and they put it on the altar. They cut it up and so on, and they put it on the altar, and that's what they eat. And so God says that their sacrifices are not pleasing to him. Several scriptures speak of God not wanting sacrifices. And of course, a lot of people take that, well, yeah, he did away with the sacrifices. Well, yeah, but for different reasons. But Israel, for instance, there was no in Israel, there was no sincerity in the sacrifices. Let's say that they took a bullock or they took a lamb in, but it wasn't a sincere sacrifice. They did it because they were supposed to do it.
Yeah,
Or
I agree with that, Skip. I don't think that this is saying that they were offering unclean um, meats to on the altar. Um, I think that this is reflective of, as you said, a number of places where God says, "Away with your sacrifices." You're not sacrificing to me, and this is, I believe, what the message is. It's indicative of the fact that these people weren't honoring God in their life, that they were going through a pretense, and you can't just do the strict. Well, really, he's saying you can't just do the letter of the law when your attitude stinks. When you're not really worshiping me, I don't care about the other, because all of that is designed to for you know making people approachable to him. And if their whole life is the wrong way, they can offer whatever animal they want, and it's not going to be effective because of that problem.
yeah, going through the motions, I think, is a good way to look at this. They were just going through the motions. God said, you're supposed to sacrifice. Okay, all right, get the cow. Let's go. Do a sacrifice. And it was totally insincere. And you mentioned one of the scriptures about God saying he didn't want to have anything to do with their sacrifices. And I've got in 1 Samuel 15:22, and this is not as good as the one you just mentioned. It was, what was it? Away with your sacrifices. How did you phrase that?
Yeah, away with. I'm not sure that's an exact quote though.
Well, it's a great paraphrase. But in 1 Samuel 15, uh, Samuel says, has Yahweh as great a delight in burnt offerings and sacrifices as in obeying the voice of Yahweh? I think Samuel is actually saying, you guys, your attitude's totally wrong. And God, he didn't want to have anything to do with your burnt offerings and sacrifices, because it's better to obey than to go through the motions of a sacrifice. And to heed is better than the fat of rams. So, but if you think about it, these people are about to be taken into a country that doesn't have anything to do with God. Of course, Israel's getting to the point where they don't either. But in Assyria, the captive Israelites would not even be able to present wine offerings or sacrifices, because there would be no temple to the Lord there. Yeah, they could build one, but I don't think these people would have any desire to build an altar to Yahweh at all. So whatever sacrifices they did offer would be like, as he said in back up here, it would be like the bread of mourners to them, unclean and unacceptable, and the food touched by a mourner who was defiled by a dead body. And anyone eating the meat for those kind of sacrifices would also be unclean, ceremonially unclean. We understand that. And the question in verse 5, which is the next verse, shows the plight of Israel. I'll just put that up here. They're captive in Assyria. They don't have temples to Yahweh. They don't have sacrifices. And so they're unable to celebrate the Moeds, the commanded feasts and festivals. He says, well, what are you going to do in the appointed day? You don't have any altars. You don't have anybody worshiping Yahweh. And, what are you going to do? And what are you going to do on the feast of the Lord? These days still came about. The Passover day was still there. It's still the 14th day of the first month, but they didn't do anything. They didn't have anything. The Feast of Trumpets and so on. What are you going to do in the appointed day? So, if they're unable to offer what's acceptable to God, then what are they going to do on the day of their appointed feast? Now, we look at holy days a little bit different, but we're looking back and we see Jesus Christ between us and these people. And so we look at the holy days with a whole different understanding, but they didn't know all of that. And so, I'm not 100% sure what the people of Israel before Jesus Christ came, what they felt were the meanings of the holy days, if they even thought there was a meaning to the holy days. Now, we know that the first thing Jeroboam the first did was to establish an alternate festival for the Feast of Tabernacles and do it a month later than what was in the law, Leviticus 23. And so they separated themselves from the temple in Jerusalem. And what were their celebrations about? I don't know. In exile, when they were in Assyria, they couldn't bring what was required, and they had forfeited all rights really to observe those holy days. And if the feast set up by Jeroboam is the one that we're talking about here, what will you do in the appointed day and on the day of the feast of Yahweh? He may have been specifically speaking of the Feast of Tabernacles that Jeroboam had changed. So anyway, all right, verse 6 says, "For indeed they're gone." Yeah.
Can I make a comment?
Please.
Just reading, looking at that in the past, I was just, it made me think about the modern parallel that we went through as a church organization, 20 some years ago, almost 30 years ago, when our church attendance, if you want to put it, or worship, quote, sacrifice, had become somewhat meaningless or rote, or you showed up at church, everything was always done the same way. It was as though the church and the people were just stuck in a tradition and a way of doing things that we felt like we were obeying God and serving Him and doing what we should, but we weren't really growing or seeking Him, or everything was kind of entrenched and steeped in the way it was done. And then behind the scenes, you had the guys in the corporate group that were seeking to derail everything and take everybody off into a different kind of captivity, if you want to put it that way. They had plans to change the holy days, to move people over to keeping Christmas and Easter and all that stuff. And you look back and it's kind of like God said, when I'm going to tip the tub over, before this all goes down to see, you know, if we can shake some people out before they all go into captivity. I just saw a lot of modern parallels of what we've been through, and what would our quote feast days have looked like if everybody had stayed with the Grace Communion group, that are now doing Christmas and Easter and all that stuff. I just thought it was an interesting parallel. That's all.
I do too. And Jill, I've never thought about the parallel between what happened in 1995 and what happened with Jeroboam the first. When he said, "Okay, I'm in charge now. We're changing everything." I see Joe DeCoch, kind of doing the same thing. I'm in charge now. We're changing everything. So I think you make a great point. There are too many parallels between what's going on now and what happened at various times in the lives of Israelites. It seems like we're always trying to get away from God. And you know what I mean by we. So anyway, well, thanks. Yeah.
No, I just comment. I think a lot of it also has to do with the fact that I think Joe keyed in on the fact that people always wanted things to be done a certain way. And I know we've experienced with the feast that people don't want any changes of any kind to what it is that they've grown accustomed to. And even if the Spirit is moving us in a different direction in terms of being more involved in evangelism, getting involved in mission work, gravitating our expansion to include our ladies to be able to be more to share their gifts. There's a lot of people that have a lot of resistance because they want to go back to the way things were done back in the late 60s and early 70s. And there's a lot of pushback with that. And so it's kind of a catch-22. You got one group of people that want to destroy the foundations, and then you have people that don't want to grow. And the result of both is you have destruction, you have a shrinking church, which is what we're beset with.
Yeah, and I'm going to add a third thing to that as you were talking, it kind of hit me. There's a third group that's afraid of going back to 95. That we can't change anything because look what happened last time. So I think you have three different schools of thought. You may have more than that, but I can see three. The feast that we have at Hot Springs, we've got the afraid of 95 coming back group there, and I'm not criticizing them. I'm just saying, they don't want to change things because hey, Skip, look, if you talk about the birth of Christ on opening night like Ron Dart did, the next thing you know, we're going to be keeping Christmas, or you're going to try to make us keep Christmas, and so I agree with you 100%, Michael, but I do think there's
that's unbelievable. That's amazing. You mean, how did they expect that Jesus was born? I mean, did he just kind of appear there as a phantom, which is exactly opposite from what the scripture talks about? It makes no sense.
I know. I agree with you 100%. They don't want it talked about because, the next thing you know, we're going to be worshiping,
what do they do when they read the first part of Luke and Matthew?
They don't.
I mean, literally, if they don't read it.
Well,
they glance over it. I mean, I think Skip's really keyed in on a point that's plagued us, and that is the irrational fear that somehow by doing these things that are outside of the way things used to be done, we're going to go right into keeping Christmas and Easter. I think because the church's main push and doctrinal teaching was less on the Gospels and what the Spirit can enable us to do, and more on what's the words, the terms Ron used, Skip, of the radical
rap.
Protestantism?
Yep.
Rap. Yeah, that's it. And that seemed to be the biggest doctrinal teaching of the corporate church was, these are Satan's church. I remember how many sermons Eric and I heard. Anything having to do with what either the Protestants, the evangelicals, or the Catholics are doing is somehow something that we're to eschew as of Satan himself. And so I think you have people raised in a culture where any small tiny hint of that has to be pushed back against, because we don't want to end up like Grace Communion. We don't want to end up going apostate like they did. So there's that aspect. I think that's a very astute point that you made there about all this also, Skip.
Yeah, I'm not criticizing these folks. I understand where they're coming from, but my job and Blake's, now that I've turned it over to him, is know your audience. And if Michael and Bernard and their feast group came down to Hot Springs, we'd have 4 people left. Because they just could not handle the growth that they've had at their church. At their feast, and they want a good old traditional feast in Hot Springs, and it's kind of my job to toe the line, if you will. So good or bad, whether people agree or not, I know who my audience is, and so I'm careful.
I think that's wisdom. And I think another part of the wisdom is recognizing that God gives us a giant buffet table, and we have the liberty to be able to go where we're being led, where we are comfortable in keeping these moeds. That things don't have to be a cookie cutter of everything else, and I think that's a sign of maturity, that that our Father has given us this big banquet table, and we can make a decision of what it is that we want to partake in. And I think that's the better attitude to have, because what's the point of eschewing this person because they're not exactly the way that we are, from one degree or another. I think there's a lot of maturity in that.
Yeah. So
Well, I think there's another, a broader aspect as well, outside of just our church culture, is and we've seen it over the last probably 25 or 30 years in mainstream Christianity, is that people want it to be easy to worship God. And you saw in the modern churches that you'd see big billboards, come as you are, and you'd see pictures of people with flip-flops and tattoos and casual clothes, and the implication, the message was, we don't judge you by your appearance, and everybody's welcome, and we want it to be easy for you to come to church. And I think that's where our church culture has always struggled against that to some degree, because the mainstream culture says, just believe on the name of Jesus and you're good to go. Come in your flip-flops, profess Jesus, and you don't really need to do anything. And yet we see in the scripture where it says, there are plenty of people who said, Lord, Lord, and I said to them, I don't know you. And, so when you look at that, you go, okay, there's more than just professing the name of Jesus. And so as in our church culture, we saw the mainstream Christianity going that way, just professing the name of Jesus. And yet we saw the scripture that said, no, there's more. You have to do what I say. But, mainstream Christianity, looking back in the Hebrew scriptures, found too many things to do or whatever, that they didn't really understand what part of it, and even, you have to wonder what the disciples thought. What part of of all the traditions from the Hebrew scripture were, were to be carried over after the death and resurrection of Jesus. And and really what that just requires is personal effort on your part, a seeking heart and a desire to learn and grow and understand, not about, you know, what's the set of rules that I have to still go by, but more about how do I develop this relationship. And it's just, it's not an easy thing, but you know, then we have to remind ourselves of the scripture that says, you know, narrow is the way and few there are that find it. And the implication is that it's, you know, the broad way that everybody goes on, it's easy and it feels comfortable and it doesn't ask a lot of you. And yet the scripture says, you know, narrow is the way and it'll be difficult and few of you will find it. So we're constantly finding ourselves, you know, kind of torn between those things of wanting to make it available to lots of people and encouraging a lot of people to start the journey, and yet not wanting to force them into a little narrow track that we've created, and yet knowing that the big broad way is not what the scripture says is good. So, you know, I think we're still on that journey of finding the narrow way, without getting ourselves all tied up in knots about it. So it's just life's a journey, I guess. That's all.
Yeah, and you know I think our job is to explain to people what we believe and then not fight about it, not argue about it. You know, I don't care what calendar someone uses. I could care less. They're worshiping God. Uh, you know, they're observing holy day. I know holy days is a you know a big thing to most of us, and we need to observe them. But well, anyway, yeah, you're exactly right, Jill, and thank you. So let me go on, or we'll be here all day. I guess that's okay though. Verse 6. Hosea comes back to, you know, why these people are disappearing. They're gone because of destruction. They've just, you know, Assyria's coming down. Egypt shall gather them up. You know, metaphorically, that's Assyria. Memphis shall bury them. Apparently, there were large cemeteries in Memphis, Egypt. And I think that may be why Hosea is mentioning Memphis here. Nettles shall possess their valuables of silver, and thorns shall be in their tents. So some of the people had fled for fear of devastation, for fear of Assyria. Some had fled to Egypt, hoping there to find some temporary refuge till the Assyrians got all they wanted and left town. But as it happened, those who flee from God and went to Egypt, which apparently some of them did, they fell into more certain devastation. They had fled Assyria, but they'd gotten back to the place that God brought them out of a long time ago, and that's Egypt. Um, and a picture of utter desolation is given here. It doesn't matter. I mean, they stay in Israel and they're going to get captured by Assyria. If they go to Egypt, they're going to be imprisoned down there. And
I
yeah,
think I think verse 6 here is we could call this a consequence of the first verse, which is that they played the harlot. They were whores, and this is the result of that. You know, everyone they hoard themselves out to is gonna, you know, gather them up, destroy them, bury them, possess their valuables, and all of these things. I think that's what this says also.
yep. Yeah. Hosea is saying destruction would sweep over the land. And where's the scripture? It says those that escape the sword will be, something else will happen to them. And if they escape that, something else is going to happen to them. I forgot where that was. But those who happen to escape the sword of Assyria would face exile. They'd be exiled down to Egypt. But that reference probably has the same meaning as it does in preceding verses. It could be metaphorical, it could be literal, or it could be both. So here it symbolizes the ultimate destination of the exiles, a foreign graveyard, whether that be Assyria, whether it be Syria, or whether it be Egypt. They're going to die in a foreign land. The people have no land anymore. I'm talking about the northern tribes. They're ultimately going to be scattered throughout the world. We don't know where they are. Maybe us, maybe some of us on this call are Israelites, but the bloodline has been what's the word I'm looking, diluted so many times. Who knows? Well, God knows, but it doesn't really make any difference. But anyway, so few would ever return to their homeland. And meanwhile, back in Israel, the exiles' possessions, their treasures of silver, their homes, would lie in ruins and would be overgrown by briars and thorns. And so Egypt, instead of becoming a refuge, would become a burial ground. And it's metaphorically Assyria, but the same thing is happening in both places in the sense of being a new enslaver in a place of banishment. Egypt will take care of the Israelites, but they'll make slaves out of them again. So, all right, let's see here. Verse 7. The days of punishment have come. I mean, Hosea is really laying it out here. Folks, you've gone too far. And God's done with you all. He says the days of punishment have come. The days of recompense have come. God's going to punish. And you people know, but here's what you all think. You think the prophet of God's a fool. And you think the spiritual man is insane. That's what they thought of Hosea and Amos and Joel. And he says, because of the greatness of your iniquity, your sins, and great enmity, your hatred of God's stuff. 2 Kings 9:11. And you all should remember this. This is when Elisha has sent his servant to anoint Jehu and I forgot the king that was anointed. But anyway, it says, then Jehu came out to the servants of his master. And so they said, what's going on? How come that guy wanted to take you back in the room? What does this madman, why did he come to you? Why did he pull you out of the bunch? And he said to him, oh, the man and his babble. This guy's crazy. And this is kind of the way that the Israelites are looking at Hosea. Those days had come, days in which God would intervene and he would repay each according to his works. We're not saved by our works, but we can sure be punished because of them. And Israel had not known when they were told what to do. But now that it's happening, they're beginning to understand it. God had allowed false prophets to delude these people. And so they wouldn't listen to sound advice from a man like Hosea, but they would listen to these false priests of Baal. And so Hosea announces that the days of punishment were coming. You can't avoid them. And he calls for them to understand it. You need to at least understand why this is happening. But Israel had sunk so deep into sin that the people considered any prophet who warned them to be a madman and a fool. And since the prophets stood with these prophets, like Hosea, stood with God over Israel, and the people were motivated by animosity, and they sought to entrap them. They wanted to throw him in jail. We got to shut this guy up. Verse 8. The watchman of Ephraim, and remember, when Ephraim is the same as Israel in this case. The watchman of Ephraim is with my God. But the prophet, he's talking about false prophets, but the prophet is a fowler's snare in all his ways, enmity in the house of his God. And Hosea is a watchman for Israel. And his ministry, was seen as traitorous. Did I say that right? Traitorous? He was a traitor. And he's being forced to navigate all of the obstacles that they put in his way. They try to shut him up. They no telling what all they've done with Hosea. And he faces continual resentment. Even though the house of his God, if you will, may refer to the land, it may also refer to the temple. Enmity in the house of his God, or enmity in the land of his God. In other words, the very place where this man of God, Hosea, should have found agreement and understanding, he found exactly the opposite. Now, let's go back to Ahab for a minute. Ahab hated God's prophet, Elijah, because he didn't speak good things concerning him. That's what he was used to. He was used to, get out of my face, Elijah. I've got prophets that are telling me everything's fine. I'm a good king, and things are going to be wonderful. So the kings of Israel over time had prophets of their own to speak soft things to them, friendly to their ears. And if I know you remember on Mount Carmel that 450 prophets of Baal and 400 prophets of Astaroth and other Baals were killed. Well, it's easy to see that the prophets who were killed were replaced within a short time by more prophets who spoke kind words to and about the kings of Israel. Jezebel would have made sure of that. And these prophets misled the kings, and they allowed them to maintain their hold over the people. But they encouraged them in disbelieving the warnings of God. They weren't going to listen to the prophets of God. They would listen to the prophets that spoke smooth things. And those prophets led directly to their destruction. Verse 9. They are deeply corrupted, as in the days of Gibeah. Now, I found this to be really, really interesting. It says, he will remember their iniquity, he will punish their sins. Gibeah means mountain or hilltop or something like that. And what Hosea is doing here is that when he mentions Gibeah, he's implying that the Israelites are doing the same thing that was done in Gibeah. And if you remember, the people of Gibeah committed a heinous crime against the concubine of a Levite who was their guest. These men were bisexual, I suppose. And this is one of the most shocking examples of sin in the Old Testament. And it led to a civil war and brought the tribe of Benjamin to the brink of annihilation. Well, here's what happened. There was a Levite that came into Gibeah, and he had a concubine with him. And these bisexual men came and asked to be given this Levite so they could go do their thing with him. But instead, the innkeeper or whatever said, I'm not going to let you guys have him, but I'll let you have his concubine. So the concubine was given to these men, and she was raped all night long, and she died at the innkeeper's door. I say innkeeper; it was wherever this man of Benjamin was staying. And on that occasion, it was said, "Such a thing has never been seen or done, not since the day the Israelites came out of Egypt." But Hosea is bringing this up and saying that the black mark on Israel's history way back then was now being rivaled by Israel's blatant sins against Yahweh. Now, think on that as a comparison. We're going to compare what's going on in Israel to the rape and murder of this concubine that actually led to a war, and it led to the tribe of Benjamin almost being totally wiped out. The rape and the murder of this concubine and the subsequent war between, I'm sorry, it was Benjamin. I don't know who I've been saying, but against Benjamin was going to fight against all the 11 others, the 11 other tribes. And you can read about this, by the way, if you want to read about it in Judges 19 and 20. And through God's judgment, the whole tribe of Benjamin perished except for 600 men. And I don't think there were any women. I think in this case, it was everybody was killed except for 600 men. So God seemed for a time to allow Benjamin to be victorious over Israel. They had a temporary, looks like they're winning. But in the end, they were punished almost to extermination. And Gibeah, this town on a hill, was destroyed. So now, many, many, many years later, although God put up with Israel for a long time, in the end, it would show that he remembered everything that they had done because he was going to punish them for all of their sins. And I had forgotten this story until one of the commentaries sent me back to take a look at it. And I think it's worth taking a look at. It's in Judges 19 and 20. I don't know how many of you all remember the story. I did not, but I do now. Verse 10, he goes on, and Hosea says, I've originally, I found Israel like grapes in the wilderness. And I saw your fathers as the first fruits on the fig tree in his first season. This is speaking of the best tasting grapes. I mean, you're going through a desert and you see some grapevines, and you go over and you take some grapes off and you eat them, and oh my goodness gracious, they are so good. And he said, I saw your fathers as the first fruits on a fig tree. This is the first year the figs had come out, and oh man, are they tasty. But they went on to Baal Peor, and they separated themselves to that shame. and they became an abomination like the thing that they loved. And this is a reference to Israel's early days as a nation and how God found her and chose her. And she was like the grapes found in the desert. And they were like the early fruit of the fig tree. But it didn't last long. Yahweh's attitude toward his people soon changed. And when they arrived at Peor, this is a place, they engaged in sexual immorality with Moabite men and women as part of their fertility rites associated with the worship of, what's the name of it? Baal Peor. It used to be Peor, but they've corrupted it, and they are worshiping, I guess maybe many lords or a particular Baal, and the name is changed to Baal Peor by Hosea. And this deity, which God called that shameful idol, may have been a local god of the Canaanite fertility god Baal. It may have been the fertility god Baal. And so this event in Moses' day is mentioned here by Hosea because it set the pattern for Israel's history. What's about to happen, what's been happening for 150 years. I guess you'd have to say for 250 years, it'd be the whole time that the nation was segregated. In Hosea's day, Israel had defiled herself by making Baal her lover, or many lovers. And like the generation at Peor, they also had engaged in fertility rites. Verse 11, as for Ephraim, and again, that's talking about Israel, their glory shall fly away like a bird. No birth, no pregnancy, no conception. So he's saying, Israel had glory for a little while. They had glory even up to the time of Jeroboam II. But he says this glory is going to fly away like a bird. And you know what no birth, no pregnancy, no conception would lead to? No children being born. So Ephraim's glory here is associated with the lack of offspring, which would depart as swiftly as a bird. And many of those who tried to secure fertility through Baal worship would become sterile and barren. And in contrast, others would miscarry, if there was a pregnancy, or they would watch their children die in the forthcoming invasion. No matter what, they're not growing. Their population was going to drop and drop fast. And it talks later, I think, about women's breasts becoming dry because they would have no children to nurse. And we're going to see that down in verse 14. Now, the Revised Standard Version translates Hosea 9:13 as Ephraim's sons, as I have seen, are destined for a prey. They're destined to be a prey for Assyria, a prey for Syria, a prey for Phoenicia, a prey for Egypt. They're going to be a prey. So Ephraim here had departed with God. God didn't depart from Ephraim, from Israel. Israel departed from God. And he would quickly take from Israel all the good things which they counted for glory, and the things that they gloried in. Now, back in Genesis, when Jacob blessed his children, you remember, I think it's Genesis 49, the name Ephraim contained the promise of their future fruitfulness. And I'm sure everybody's read the USNBC, and if you haven't read it, don't. But anyway, with Jacob had Jacob had blessed them, and Ephraim was to become greater than Manasseh and his elder brother, and so on. It says his seed will become like a multitude of nations. And on this blessing, Ephraim had presumed and had made it feed their pride. So now, many years later, God, in his justice and mercy, would withdraw these blessings from them. And the glory that God gave to Ephraim through making her a great nation, after he found her, he found her in the desert. He alluded to that earlier, Hosea did. It would fly away like a bird because of her recurring sin. No birth, no pregnancy, no conception. So the population is going to decrease. And even if children were born, they would die young before reaching adulthood, either from disease or from being killed by an invading army or whatever. But Israel is doomed to become a small nation. Verse 12.
Like us.
Yeah, Michael. Yeah, like us. Good point. That's exactly right.
You go back, those last several verses you read are just, it might as well be indictments for the United States of America, because I mean, that curse there in 11 is we're living it. That's why they say they have to replace the current population, because we have a negative replacement birth rate, and we have to have all these migrants brought in here to do the jobs we won't do, supposedly. But I mean, you consider between abortion, people no longer getting married because there's no point in it anymore. You've got the whole incel movement going on because of the women's lib movement has destroyed even the remote desire for men to even seek marriage. Because I remember one guy saying, "Why would I consider getting married? Because the moment I say I do, she's going to go and take half of my pension and everything I make, and she's going to run off with whomever, because marriage, there's no sanctity in it anymore." And so people aren't getting married. If they are, they're waiting until they're much later. The women are choosing careers over a family. Women were being shamed for years for having a family instead of a career. And of course, now the government is actually engaged in encouraging people not to have kids, because having more kids means we're going to increase global warming or climate change or whatever they're calling it now. So all of these curses we're reading here, all of these proclamations of the destruction that Ephraim and Israel are going to suffer, folks, they're applied to us right now. Just read the news on a daily basis, and you see all of these things. At least the God we worship is consistent. I will say that. That's it.
Yeah. Yep. Okay. So verse 12. Though they bring up their children, yet I will bereave them to the last man. Yeah, woe to them when I depart from them. They're going to be killed. They're going to starve to death. They're going to, they may have children and they may bring them up, but they're not going to last long, not going to live long. God had threatened to deprive them of children in every stage before or at their birth. And now he tells them, as those who should escape this sentence, the ones that flee to Egypt, the ones that are taken into Assyria, he would bereave them of these children. He would, they would lose them, or he would make them childless. And God's departure was the source of all judgment to them, and it was the last step, if you will, in the scale of misery. God would turn his favor from Israel because of her unfaithfulness. This form of punishment, this problem with children and negative growth, would precede the captivity to Assyria, and the captivity itself would be their end, be the end of Israel. And here he goes on in verse 13, he says, just as I saw Ephraim, or Israel, like Tyre, planted in a pleasant place, So Ephraim will bring out his children to the murderer. I should have put a map in here, but Tyre was in a good location over there, right next to the ocean, and Israel was in a great location. All the caravan trade between Egypt and the countries to the north had to pass right through Israel because the Mediterranean Sea was to the west. They couldn't go that way. And the desert was to the east. So they went right up through the middle of Israel. And she was like Tyre. Tyre was over there. If you wanted to come by sea, you're going to land in Tyre. But Israel failed to realize her potential because of her sins. And so ultimately, Israel is to bring out their sons to the one doing the killing. And she was proud of her wealth, proud of her high estate, and she was pleasantly situated and firmly rooted. One thing lay before her, one destiny, one end. And Hosea here says they were to bring out children only for their murderer. No other reason. Verse 14, give them, O Lord. Well, what will you give? Give them a miscarrying womb and dry breasts. Same thing. It's been talking about the last two verses. They're not going to have children. Hosea seems to be praying that the people of Israel, while blessed with children before, now prays that they have no more children. Now, that's a blessing for the children that aren't born, I suppose. You could look at it that way. They're not going to have to go through the captivity. And so the choice was either to miscarry or watch their children die in the forthcoming invasion. The women's breasts would be dry because they wouldn't have any children to nurse. Their milk would dry up. This would be more merciful, though, than watching their children murdered. But this prophecy carries over to Jerusalem. And here's what Jesus said. And, I'm jumping way forward for this one. And there followed him a great company of people and of women, which also bewailed and lamented him. But Jesus, turning to them, said, daughters of Jerusalem, don't weep for me. Weep for yourselves. Weep for your children, because the days are coming in which they will say, blessed are the barren, and the wombs that never bore, and the paps which never gave suck, because the children would not suffer, because they would not be born. Same thing that's happening or going to happen. Hosea is telling them that in Israel. And I left out the verse in Hosea. All their wickedness is in Gilgal, for there I hated them because of the evil of their deeds. I will drive them from my house. I will love them no more. All their princes are rebellious. And here and back in verse chapter 4, Hosea said, though you Israel play the harlot, let not Judah offend. Judah, you guys don't need to do the same thing that Israel's doing. Don't come up to Gilgal. If you remember Gilgal, it became the place of false worship. Nor go up to Beth Aven. And this is Hosea had changed the name of Bethel to Beth Aven, which is a very negative. I forgot the exact translation. It's very negative. Don't swear an oath saying, as the Lord lives, for Israel is stubborn, like a stubborn calf. Now Yahweh will let them forage like a lamb in open country. Ephraim is joined to idols. They don't just worship the idols. They are joined to the idols. Leave him alone. Let him dig his own grave. Give him a shovel. Their drink is rebellion. They commit harlotry continually. Her rulers dearly love dishonor. I'm sorry, I almost said dishonesty. Her rulers dearly love dishonor. The sinful people of Israel were now the object of God's hatred. I hate to use that word, but it's there, rather than his love. Yahweh had become displeased with his metaphorical wife, unfaithful Israel, and he was prepared to drive her from the household, from the land. And he had withdrawn his love, had withdrawn his blessings. The rebellious nation whose opposition to Yahweh's covenant was epitomized by the Gilgal fertility cult, and they would be expelled from his house. That's how far down Gilgal, which was one of the places of the worship of Yahweh, how far down they had gone. So now Israel was about to suffer the same fate as the Canaanites, whose practices it had assimilated. Israel had gone into Canaan and had assimilated themselves into the nation and the worship and the marriage of Canaanites. What God had said, do not do. I got to let a dog out. She's trapped in the office. Go. Hosea also here may be alluding to Adam and Eve's initial expulsion from God's presence, way back where there were just two of them. Gilgal had been the scene of many of God's mercies, yet it was chosen as a popular place for idol worship. And doubtless the people of Israel still deceived themselves, and they thought that, oh, this idolist worship is okay because it's in a place that was once hallowed, and it's still hallowed, they thought. And so their idolatrous worship would be acceptable to God. And so this sin of Israel was no ordinary sin. They knew what they were doing. It was not a sin of ignorance. So the severe treatment of Israel, which is what's about to happen, was a lot to blame with all their wickedness in Gilgal. By this time, Gilgal had clearly become a center of false worship. I should have put a map up here. Sorry about that. Verse 16. Ephraim is stricken. Their root is dried up. They're not going to bear any fruit. Yeah, they were going to bear children, but they're not now, because I would kill the darlings of their womb. So ironically, because of widespread sterility that God struck Israel with, and infant mortality, their children were dying, Ephraim, or Israel, once a symbol of fruitfulness, would be compared to a withered plant. Ephraim is stricken, their root is dried up. They shall bear no fruit. They're being compared to a withered plant incapable of bearing fruit because of her disobedience, Israel was being rejected by God. And so the prophet here uses a metaphor of a plant or metaphor of a tree with roots. And he repeats the same sentence upon Israel. The roots dried up, they'll bear no fruit. And yet will I slay, it says, their beloved fruit of their womb, the desired fruit of their bodies that their souls long for. You know, they're either going to die in the womb, or they're going to die shortly after birth, or they're going to be murdered. Because, you know, the Assyrians don't want to mess with a bunch of kids. They're coming down there. They want people to work for them. Uh, they don't want a bunch of 4 day old, 30 day, 1 year old children that they have to mess with. So Hosea here returns to the warning that Israel would be diminished in population. We've seen that what in 3 verses so far, maybe 4, and again using the example of a plant. The people would be withered right down to the root and thus rendered fruitless and hopeless. And the last verse, verse 17, my God will cast them away. Why? Because they didn't obey him. Now, we're not talking about that they, they didn't observe the Sabbath, or they didn't observe the holy days, or they ate pork chops. We're talking about 250 years of these people throwing God out of the classroom, of the courts, of people's lives, to bring it up to today's problems. My God will cast them away because they didn't obey him over 250 years. And they shall be wanderers among the nations. And I think that's very prophetic, because that's what happened to Israel. Israel is still wandering among the nations, and we don't know who they are. We don't know where they are. We don't know if we're part of Israel. Again, I was talking about how our bloods have melded with other bloods and so on. So in exile, Israel's people would become wanderers among the nations. Again, the punishment fits the crime. They're not God's people. He's not going to take care of them anymore. Those who willfully strayed from the path were condemned to wander aimlessly among those outside the covenant, the ones that don't know anything about the law of God, about the covenants that Israel made with God. We don't know where the descendants of the northern tribes are today. Just Wednesday at our Bible study, it was mentioned, and Gary mentions this, maybe not every week, but quite often. Well, we Gentiles, and I'm kind of sitting back, and I'm thinking, you think so? You think we're Gentiles? We may not be. And I've even spoken to them about the scattering of the northern tribes. And the comment that I get back from them is, well, Skip, that can't be us. We're Gentiles. Well, we may be Gentiles, but we may not be. So anyway, this was the sentence of Cain. If you remember, he was cast out. He became a fugitive and a vagabond on the earth. And that's what God says is going to happen to the northern tribes. God had forewarned them. He said, the Lord will scatter you among all people, from the one end of the earth even to the other. And among these nations, you will not find ease, and neither will the sole of your foot have rest. The words of the prophet imply a continuing condition. So, in summary, it's hard to summarize this whole chapter, but God is rejecting these people because of their persistent disobedience. And as a result, they would become wanderers among the nations. It's another allusion to their coming captivity. Okay. That's the end of my notes. So any thoughts, any comments, corrections? these songs and poems just really just give me a feel.
Well, you can't say that the great God Yahweh didn't warn them.
Yeah.
I mean, this is only one place. There's multiple places. So it's like And some of these prophets crossed over with each other. I mean, there's I believe there's some scriptures that said, I warned them again and again and again.
Yeah.
They didn't listen.
We're a stubborn people. Israel as a nation was a stubborn people. And, and God even says that Judah was worse because they saw what happened to the northern tribes and they saw why. And yet they went ahead and did it anyway. So, okay. Let's see. Looking at next week, unless somebody else wants to speak, we will continue with Hosea chapter 10. And hopefully I can get something out of something, understand it, get help from commentaries or whatever. And by the way, when I say commentaries, I mean I don't just look at one commentary. And I know Michael doesn't like to do this, but I look at 8 or 9 commentaries, and sometimes 4 or 5 different translations, because I don't just trust one commentary, and I'm sure you all don't either. So okay,
Eric and I will not be here next week. Just FYI, programming note.
okay,
Yeah, Brian is supposed to go to West Tennessee, and I think Clint confirmed it, but if that's so, then Erica hasn't seen Brian and Stephanie in many years, so we're gonna